G'day folks, welcome to this review of Cataclysm, a Second World War. This is a grand strategic Second World War and beyond game designed by William Slavic and Scott Muldoon and published by GMT Games in 2018. This is really innovative design. It is not your traditional type of war game. It is I'd be inclined to label it more almost a resource management game, heavy Euro wargame hybrid, where really your resources are your activation chips, which include things like flags and units and operations, which you throw into this cup and draw them out to activate. There's so much more going on in this game than that little summary can cover. But hopefully by the end of this video you'll have a sense of what it's like and we'll get an idea of whether or not it's of interest. So this is ultimately about three ideologies fighting. It is, and the rules make no apologies about this, it is ideally a three-player game with each of those three players playing as one of the ideologies. The fascists, who play Germany, Italy and Japan, the democracies, and the player will play France, the UK and the USA, and the communists, with the player playing just the Soviet Union. So you will play, in a three-player game, you'll play all three of those powers or the Soviet Union. You can, of course, play it with 4 or 5 or just 2. It's great solitaire. It just changes things up a bit. So with 5 players, you might have 2 players playing the fascists. One player is Germany, the other one as Italy and Japan. They're working together for their ideology cooperatively against the other ideologies and players. In a 2-player game, there are smaller scenarios such as the Eastern Front, where you can just have Germany versus the Soviet Union. So there's enough in there for variable play counts, but I think for the full experience, the full dynamic, interactive, diplomatic, military experience, you ideally want to play with 3 players, one with each of the ideologies. Now, as I said, this is quite an innovative hybrid game, heavy. There's about a 40-page rulebook, and as I said, it's focused on the Second World War. There's a lot of diplomacy, a lot of pre-war maneuvering, diplomatic maneuvering and industrial maneuvering, mobilizing your resources and mobilizing industries basically to drive your strategy in a particular direction. I'll talk more about that in a moment, but basically you will use your resources to enlarging your force pool to shift you towards sort of a naval, air, land-based type of thinking. We may focus heavily on diplomacy. There's a lot you can do here. This has been described as a sandbox game where you have sort of the setting of Europe and the Pacific, and well, the world is your oyster. What do you want to do? Diplomacy, support civil wars, really focus on strong, aggressive land-based forces, defensive land-based forces, air power, strategic bombing, naval power, submarines to cut off supplies, all these kind of things. There is a lot you can do. Because it's ideally a 3-player game, there's a fascinating tension between the 3 players. You don't kind of want to be too aggressive against one of the ideologies, because you're giving the third ideology then an upper hand. So it's a careful balancing act between aggression and kind of steady growth, which is a difficult aspect of the game to grasp, really. So it certainly benefits from repeated plays. Grasping the game, learning how the mechanics will work, learning what are viable strategies, and then learning how the interaction between the 3 ideologies and their powers works. So I keep going back to this idea of abstraction. All these things are heavily abstracted. I'll return to this later on, but I want to mention out the front that this is kind of a blending of military. You've got the military forces on the map. A little army force represents 250,000 troops, just for scale there. So the UK, for example, won't have many of these on the map. France won't have many of these. Italy won't have many of these on the map. You are abstracting industry. You need to buy these military forces with resources, or build them rather, and that requires resources. You get the resources from control of areas. How powerful, how effective these are, your effectiveness of your industries and military operations is kind of reflected by your level of mobilization. Mobilization is an important factor. I'll talk about this in a moment as well. You start off at civilian status generally, depending on the scenario you play. The lowest is civilian status, where you have a limited force pool, very stable government and home front, but you can't build a lot. And gradually you'll seek to increase your war commitment, which will enlarge your force pool, which will make your industry, put it more on a war footing, and enhance your ability to build units and engage in offensive action. So this is gradual scaling up. You'll build alliances with other powers in your ideology. You may be engaged in some small offensives against sort of neutral nations, or support civil wars, or things like this. Heavy diplomacy. All this is going on at the same time. And again, I'll talk about it in a moment. The game revolves around this action cut, where you're putting all these chits in and pulling them out one at a time, and that dictates the sort of flow of play. It doesn't quite have the same chit pull tension that other war games do. This is almost more variable sort of event activation, and whatever sort of chit is pulled out, the player can sort of make a determination on what they want to do with that, whether it's an operation or a flag for a sort of different type of event. So but this also drives the length of turns. So when the cup is empty, or almost empty basically, when the fourth crisis marker is pulled out, the turn ends and you do sort of administration before returning to builds, and repeat this process all over again. That chit pull mechanism, though, keeps all players engaged constantly. The turns move pretty quickly, so you're always watching the cup. You're always looking at what's going on. You are always active, even in sort of in a full 3-player game, 4 or 5 players. You're always active. You'll always have, almost always have, reserve markers available, and you can use these reserve chits to interrupt a chit pull draw. Instead of drawing a counter from the cup, you can say, I want to interrupt and use my reserve counter. This is activated in effectiveness level, so the most effective nations can interrupt first. All these factors keep players engaged constantly. I mentioned everything is quite broadly abstracted, so you've got this sort of melting pot. I'll talk about this in a moment, but you have this melting pot of elements: diplomacy, military, industry, economics, home front stability, effectiveness of your nation, all these kind of things coming together in this design. Now, the three ideologies, and indeed the three powers within those ideologies, play out quite differently. Britain and France are, of course, in Europe and close to this German and Italian threat. They are early to get active and involved, and are involved in diplomacy. The USA is more removed from all this, and has to sort of build up their industrial engine, and often comes to the war quite late. The ideologies also are not necessarily allied at the start of the scenario. There are various scenarios in the game, but for the full campaign, they're typically not allied at the start. You need to work on building these alliances by engaging in diplomatic actions with the countries within your ideology, building that alliance between France, the UK, and the USA. The game will typically end where you're striving to force the surrender of two powers or a complete ideology, such as the Soviet Union. It's certainly as I said, grand strategic military game, but you're focused on so many different things: the stability of your nation, your resources, resource management, management of different types of resources, the production of particular types of units. You can decide sort of to focus on land-based forces, infantry, armor, fortifications, your air, or your naval forces. And this will sort of take you in different directions depending on what your power is. It's sort of, Germany often wants to focus so heavily on land units, but the USA has choices about air power, naval power, land units, and this will really drive your strategy. It's often been described as a sandbox game where you'll take on this ideology and you'll have a lot of choices open to you. It's certainly not the Second World War on rails. You do have choices to kind of experiment with different ideas and actions and diplomacy in particular. Much of the game revolves around your status card. So every player, every nation will have one of these: France, the UK, and the USA for the democracies, or the player playing the democracies. And this is where you manage a lot of your resources. It'll tell you your commitment level. And typically you might start off with civilian commitment, building up into rearmament. And it's a struggle to get to that point. You have to work to increase your commitment. You don't want to rush this, because whilst you're at civilian level or rearmament, you don't need to worry about instability so much on the home front. People are quite happy, they're content. As you sort of ramp up the war effort, the risk of instability increases. At the same time, whilst you're at the civilian status or rearmament, your military production levels are relatively low. You have a relatively smaller force pool. So the UK, for example, at civilian status just has 8 units in their force pool. As they begin to ramp up their war effort, they can select what type of units they want to add to their war pool. They may focus more on air power in support of France and so forth, and they may focus on fleets, of course, to consider their options. You're making these choices as you build up this war effort, and this is shaping what you're producing, and it's shaping what you're going to do with those units and where you're going and what type of strategy you're going to employ. So there's a lot of, as I said, as a sandbox game, a lot of replayability in Cataclysm, both through the various scenarios and the actions and sort of considerations you're making as you build up. As you build up to a higher war commitment as well, your production facilities become more effective. You get more effective conversion of resources to units. So whilst you're at civilian status, you can't build much. It's harder to do anything. As you ramp up to mobilization and total war, you're doing a lot more with your actions, and then you begin to get offensive actions. You can do a lot with these offensives moving around the map. Now, just point this out. This is the European theatre of operations. This is basically one half of the European theatre, and there's a Pacific theatre map which is about the same size. So you're looking at full map would be 4 times this, and you can see this is some of the main sort of areas of operation in Western Europe. You can see France is abstracted to just 4 regions with industry and natural resources. This is what you're looking at on the map, and at the start of many scenarios, this will be pretty quiet. You'll be mainly engaging in diplomacy with a lot of the neutral nations, trying to swing them over to your side, placing your influence cubes, influence markers, and trying to in effect get allies, which are in effect victory points in the long term. So the early game, everyone's at civilian status, they're engaging in diplomacy, they're trying to build up their natural alliances and get other little allies throughout Europe. Tension starts to build, things heat up, and small sort of conflicts may break out. I mentioned the different ideologies play out very differently. So the Soviet Union certainly is playing the long, slow game. They start off without many military units or resources. They want just to slow things down. The fascists are often on the front foot, looking to engage, looking to strike that knockout blow via their special surprise attacks, whereas the democracies are often negotiating, trying to build their alliances, trying to get the 3 powers working together and being able to respond to that inevitable fascist betrayal and attack. So as I said, a lot happens on your status card, on the maps, and is also managed via this record display, this common records display, which is where you show your nation's effectiveness level. You can see there are 3 levels of effectiveness. This is where you can place, I'll get to the action cup first. So the core of the game revolves around an action cup where you place all these chits in the cup, and this determines the type of actions you place. It will be things like operations or flags, and depending on what you draw from the cup dictates what type of action you can take. And this, I won't go into detail on all this, but it is all very handily summarized on these wonderful player aid sheets. There are 3 of these, 1 for each of the 3 players ideally. In the middle, all your actions are summarized, a list of military actions, and then a list of political actions. So it's pretty easy to sort of, each player will have one of these, and they'll be consulting sort of what they can do and what they want to do. So the game, once it gets going, once you sort of start pulling these chits from the cup, flows quite quickly. What can potentially slow this down is the fact that chits may be added to this cup as the turns progress. That is because powers can provoke each other by acting against the interests of those powers. So Italy and Germany, for example, may provoke France by forming an alliance, by engaging in diplomacy within their area of interest, increasing their commitment, things like this. They all provoke France. And when France is provoked, they get to add a flag counter, a French flag counter, that looks, of course, like that, to the cup. And of course, this builds a cup whilst the action round is underway. And it extends the game turn. So on some turns can be very quick. 1937 might move through very quickly. 1938 might take forever as powers are increasingly provoking each other and the cup is actually building whilst the turn is underway. And this can potentially, you can have some circumstances where it just seems to go forever as France and Italy keep provoking each other via back and forth diplomacy. Maybe France and Germany are engaging in diplomatic efforts in Benelux, and they keep provoking each other and throwing these flags into the cup. So the action cup really is the core of gameplay. You're doing a lot of sort of administration and building, but then you sort of whatever you've prepared goes into the cup, and you'll draw these out one at a time. When you draw a counter from the cup, you can place that in reserve, which is why I took a break, on this sheet. And this gives you the option to interrupt. Before you draw a counter from the cup, players in effectiveness order can decide to interrupt by playing their reserve counter to do an action. And this gives you this sort of, it's interesting how the effectiveness level of your nation as tracked by your war status is reflected by how early you can interrupt in a turn. So when you draw a counter from cup, you can place it in reserve and then later interrupt with that counter when there's something really desperate and important that you need to do. There are other various political elements of the game. As I mentioned, you engage in diplomacy with neutral nations, Denmark, Scandinavia, Benelux, other areas around the world. Things in East Asia are quite complex. There are various Chinese factions. They engage in this quite complex civil war, and it was the slowest part of the game for us. Every time we had to work through civil war, we were consulting the rulebooks. Probably the main thing that took our time and slowed the game down. We almost dreaded the civil war just because we knew we'd have to go back to those rulebooks. But that creates a bit of an interesting dynamic where there's sort of this uncertain situation evolving, and it can really swing either way. I mentioned how your war status changes sort of the state of your nation. It changes your economic situation as well. Your builds become more effective. I think I pointed that out. You get more builds, and you're tracking all this. For this reason, resources are important on the map. You're often engaging in military operations to pursue, or diplomacy to pursue resources. There are several different types of resources. Natural resources, which are just resources. You have industrial resources, which can support offensives and double as production sites. There are limited resources that basically can be removed from the map, and the Soviet Union has some special resources that they gain as well as their commitment level improves. You use these resources to build units, and look, without going into too much detail, you've got a very large pool. This shows the democracies as resources. You've got French, US, and UK. And as I said, as you increase commitment, your force pool increases, and you decide what you want to build. And you add that to your force pool, and you can choose to use those resources to build that by placing it sometimes in the cup, sometimes a turn ahead. And when that's drawn out, you can place it on the map to build those units. So it's a very fascinating way of synthesizing and bringing all these resources and war commitments and economics together in a really nice, fascinating system where you are making some really juicy, forward-thinking decisions. Does France want to fortify and defend? Do they want to think about air power and so forth? So all these things are linked. The game also tracks war status. Once a power becomes belligerent, the war goes to limited war. Once a power is at total war, we go to global war, and that changes the situation. I mentioned building alliances. So at the start of many of these scenarios, France, the UK, and the USA are not necessarily allied. And alliances are really important because they let these powers move through each other's areas. They help each other with provocation and gaining flags. And that's part of your sort of diplomatic effort, part of the actions you're taking during the action phase. There are also, each turn, each sort of year is tracked by the draw of crisis events from the cup. This results in a roll on the crisis table where random events will happen that change sort of the situation around the world. It could be sort of Scandinavian leave, the Little Entente, Polish non-aggression pact, all these things. Chinese Civil War is there somewhere, and other civil wars as well can break out. And you can engage in diplomacy to influence the outcomes, or to sort of try and lend support behind factions in that civil war. And again, there's sort of a semi-random outcome there, but it's another fascinating element of European and global East Asian situation in the late 1930s. I mentioned that diplomacy is very important. The combat mechanics here are also quite interesting, and again, heavily abstracted. Typically in a combat, you'll be rolling from 1 to 3 dice, and then applying maybe 1 or 2 modifiers. And that's really both the attacker and defender will be rolling dice. And there's this subtle but quite important distinction, or difference rather, between these extra dice and these extra little modifiers. So for example, you'll be searching for that extra +1 modifier or that extra +1 die via incorporating air superiority or armor superiority or more units, things like this. It could mean the difference. That 1 extra unit could mean the difference between rolling 3 dice with a +1 modifier versus your opponent just rolling 2 dice with no modifiers. And then you kind of leave things to the hands of fate. And of course, there are some incredibly crazy and swear and frustrating outcomes from these die rolls. So I will warn you in advance, if you absolutely hate making important die rolls where the outcomes of a battle of the fall of France hinge upon a single die roll, you might want to avoid this because, you're basically rolling 2 dice often to determine the outcomes of battles when France is 4 territories, when the United Kingdom is 2 territories, and you're rolling 2 or 3 dice to determine the fate of your capital. That's a lot riding on those die rolls. So as I said, this is a long game. There's a lot going on. You're building your economy, you're building your war commitment, you're building your units and your production, and then you engage in war. And it's quite remarkable. The build-up takes a long time. All this diplomacy and civil war and lending support for civil war and being provoked and provoking others. It's quite remarkable. The war itself tends to flow quite quickly. These offensives tend to move, and they tend to have often quite decisive outcomes, sometimes indecisive. But once somebody starts rolling, the juggernaut rolls on, and the war moves quite quickly. It's a fascinating study. It is, as I said, very heavily abstracted. It is, as I said, kind of a borderline Euro-style treatment of a war game. Traditional war gamers, hex encounter war gamers who like CRTs, may not like it. It is also quite heavy and quite complex. It is a very difficult to teach. And I'd recommend sort of a session, if you're playing with friends, I recommend a session just to kind of get everyone to wrap their head around how it works. You might want to sort of jump into the middle of a 1942 scenario to run through the core combat mechanics before you then start back at sort of civilian status to explain why they might want to build up an air force or why they might want to build up their fortifications, things like that. It's hard to understand the implications of these and why they would want to fortify France and where and things like that. So yeah, in summing up, I'm trying to sort of highlight the key points here. A very heavy game with a 39, 40-page rulebook. There is a lot to get through, but and it is a difficult teach, but I recommend just one person read through the rule and teach it to others. Save everyone reading that 40 pages. As I said, the core of the game is that sort of chip pull mechanism from the cup. You never quite know what's going to happen. And there's this kind of interesting tension between a very heavy game that does take 5, 6, 7 hours to play, versus the very wild swings of luck in combat, and the sort of the 3 dice resolution of combat, where sort of at most you're typically rolling up to 3 dice to resolve some really important battles. And I've tried to encourage my friends to think of this sort of as an experience. You can certainly get very competitive with this, but if you take this too seriously and get too sort of attached to your faction, those wild swings of dice could be very frustrating. So just kind of a fair warning there, that you kind of, there are wild swings of luck in this game, let me say that. And you kind of, I think part of the idea is to approach this as a sandbox experiment to see what might have been, and how things could have turned out. It's a great game and a great game experience, which does well to sort of model things on a very abstract, grand strategic level. It is not finely detailed. Like I said, you have, this is a representation of a British army of 250,000 troops. And they will typically just have, over the course of the war, 1 or 2 of these counters on the map. Maybe more if they choose to go down that path. But you are dealing with the abstraction, the heavy abstraction of all of these elements of the war in a way that sort of blends them all together. And that's the beauty of this game, the way that diplomacy and civil wars and support for civil war and economics and war commitment and effectiveness and home front stability with the military operations are all blended together in this one sort of melting pot of a game. I think in that final sentence there really captures what this feels like really well. It's a melting pot of all those things together in the one gaming experience. As a result, none of those really dominate. It is not sort of a military-focused war game, or a diplomacy-focused war game, or an economic-focused war game, or a political-focused war game. It is all those things sort of in the one abstracted package. I hope I've sort of conveyed a sense of what this is like. I do recommend it. We had a wonderful experience playing this, and check it out if it's of interest. It is Cataclysm: A Second World War by GMT Games. Thanks, folks.